President Xi, Madam Peng, Excellencies, honorable guests, good morning. 66% of 3.9 times 2 equal Asia. What do I mean? Asia contributes 2/3 of global growth, forecasted at 3.9% this year and next. That tells us the importance of this region. To borrow from one of our French female famous writer of the last century, who said, "Your life begins at 40. I congratulate you, President Xi, for this new life that you have identified, for the openness that you have celebrated and advocated, for the innovation and inclusiveness that you have encouraged. And you have not only been saying that in general terms, you've been very specific. Opening sectors, banking, insurance, automotive, removing caps, reducing barriers, providing a more business-friendly environment. You've advocated openness. So as you have been very practical, let me advocate the benefit of closing a few gaps, because it will help the openness that you've advocated. And I will refer to 3 gaps only. The first gap is the digital gap applied to finance. Asia, relative to the rest of the world, has probably the smallest digital gap. Yet, deciding to close that gap, in particular in favor of women, and if you were to close that gap between the least integrated Asian countries to reach the average of all the others, you would simply add 1 full percentage of GDP on a per capita basis. That's gap number 1. Gap number 2 is what I call the regulatory gap. In Asia, we see blossoming of fintech, yet those fintechs are disclosing regulatory gaps, which, if not closed both domestically and on a cross-border basis, can actually lead to systemic risks, and you want to guard against that, transform safely and be more inclusive. The third gap is a very interesting one. It's the one that I call the innovation gap. We are just publishing new IMF research, which not only, as we normally and always do, celebrate the value of trade and its contribution to growth, but it identifies how trade actually facilitates the sharing of technology. And that's another gap that can be closed. Up until now, innovation, new technologies belong to a very small group of countries. That is shifting, that is changing. 2/3 of the world robots are to be found in this region, predominantly Japan, Korea, and China. This needs to be continued. And it is through that trade that innovation will continue to be shared, and that Asia, from being a net importer of technology, will also become a net exporter of technology. And it is through those progress that you have identified, President Xi, in particular the protection of intellectual property for all, China and foreign companies alike, that this progress will actually come through. Happy next 40 years after this first success in the last 40.